Russia has accused the U.S. of orchestrating a drone attack on the Kremlin that it claims was carried out by Ukraine on Wednesday. Moscow says the incident was an attempt to assassinate President Vladimir Putin, adding that sabotage attacks by Kyiv had reached unprecedented momentum. Ukraine has denied any involvement in the drone attack. I'm joined now by our Riga bureau chief, Yuri Reshetto. Since our studio in Russia is blocked by Russian authorities, our Russian service has located to the Latvian capital. Yuri, Moscow accuses Washington of being behind the drone attacks on the Kremlin. What do you make of that?
Well, look, Terry, at first, yesterday, the Russians only spoke of Ukraine and blamed the authorities in Kyiv for the drone attacks. Now the Americans come into consideration, and the question is why Washington wasn't blamed immediately. Perhaps because the Kremlin isn't sure that the attacks actually came from Ukraine. We don't know who exactly carried out these attacks. But you have to take or to note, though, that the Russia's arguments are at least not very convincing. In addition, the Ukrainian president is speaking today in The Hague, and the world is talking about it. Perhaps Moscow wanted to steal the show, so to say, from him and to shift the attention to itself.
What strategic interest, Yuri, does the Kremlin have in blaming the U.S.?
I think Russia has never made a secret of the fact that this war is actually also a war against the West and, above all, against the USA. Right from the start, the Russians demanded negotiations about the new security architecture, as they call it, and security guarantees after NATO's eastward expansion, not with Kyiv, but with Washington. And the Kremlin wanted to speak to the White House on an equal footing, on an equal level. And that's why Russia takes every opportunity to blame America. And Russian propaganda has long claimed that the government in Kyiv is just a puppet government and that the real decision makers sit in the USA.
Yuri, thank you for now. That was our correspondent in Riga, Yuri Reshetto. Ukraine's President Vladimir Zelensky has said there can be no lasting peace with Russia without justice for his country. He made the remarks on a surprise trip to the Netherlands. Speaking after visiting the International Criminal Court in The Hague, Zelensky stressed the number of war crimes allegedly committed by Moscow. He called for the creation of a special tribunal into Russia's actions. Zelensky said that it was vital that President Putin and those responsible for the war be held accountable.
Impunity is the key that opens the door to aggression. If you look at any war, any war of aggression in the history, they all have one thing in common. The perpetrators of the war didn't believe they would have to stand to answer for what they did. They must stand to answer for war. However brings war must receive judgment.
Our correspondent Rosie Berchot is in The Hague. Rosie, you followed Zelensky's speech. What impression did he make?
Well, I spoke to one person in the room while Zelensky spoke, and he said it was a very powerful speech. Zelensky called this city, The Hague, the capital of freedom, of justice, the capital of international law. This city is, of course, home to the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, and several other special tribunals. And Zelensky really used this speech to talk about his drive and his desire to hold Russia accountable for those suspected war crimes, which now are running into the tens of thousands when we talk about numbers of suspected cases. And he really used this speech. He listed cases. He talked about suspected cases of rape, of civilian killings, of child kidnappings. And he even asked all those in the room to take a moment of silence to reflect on all of the victims. Now, President Zelensky had one very specific request, and that is he would like to see the creation of a special tribunal here in The Hague. Now, that's not something that was likely to happen overnight. It's something which is legally and politically fraught. We've seen that, for example, just how difficult it can be to see international criminal law in action distraction by the fact that President Vladimir Putin of Russia is officially a fugitive now of the International Criminal Court. There is an arrest warrant out for him. But of course, there is simply no international police force that could go and arrest him and then see him eventually stand trial here in The Hague. So legally, politically difficult. But President Zelensky said, I'm sure we will see this happen after we win. And he said, and we will win.
President Zelensky has rarely left Ukraine since Russia's invasion over a year ago. What else is on his agenda during this trip?
Well, President Zelensky made an address to Dutch lawmakers. He also made a fleeting visit to the International Criminal Court, where he met with the president of that court. And aside from that speech, which was titled "No Peace Without Justice," he's now on his way to meet with the Prime Minister of the Netherlands and the Prime Minister of Belgium. They are holding joint talks, and I think we can expect that those plans, those hopes for a special tribunal will be part of this. But let's not forget that President Zelensky in these international trips usually also puts the emphasis on the very immediate situation on the battlefield, and he will almost definitely be calling for more military aid, for more weapons. And the Netherlands says it will keep supporting Ukraine, will keep up that promise that those NATO nations, members of that Western military alliance, have made to stand by Ukraine's side for as long as it takes. Zelensky might very well be coming here with a wish list, and we know one thing he definitely wants, he's been calling for, is Western fighter jets.
Rosie, thank you very much for now. Our correspondent, Rosie Berchard, in The Hague.